students. Good morning. Good morning. We have a distinguished program today. I want to say first that in place of Kun Kavi Jongkithawan, he's an eminent journalist, columnist, and so on, but he's not able to make it today. So in addition to him, apart from him, we will have Ambassador Kasit Piromya as our discussant for today. Ambassador Kasit, of course, has been Thailand's foreign minister during 2008 to 2011. So we'll hear from Ambassador Kasit after the keynote lecture. As a way of introducing our keynote speaker today, I don't know what to say. I mean, there are many things to say. Professor Dwight Perkins, when I asked him for his bio profile, he's very modest. He sent me just a few lines. But if you have if you just search his name on your phone, you'll see he has thousands and many thousands of references on Google. And his Wikipedia is very long. So I don't have enough time to read it all, but I can tell you he has been studying China since 1954 as an undergraduate at Cornell. And he visited China for the first time in 1974. He's written 25 books, published hundreds of articles. So when you look around the world, when you see these experts on China, at universities and think tanks and various places, the go-to people that journalists and academics and students seek for advice and opinion and analysis. So they're considered experts, right? So he is the expert of the experts. That's how I want to introduce him. He is the guru of the gurus of China studies. Professor Perkins will speak for about 45 minutes or 40 minutes or so. It's really up to him. It's really my honor and privilege to introduce him, but also our good fortune to have him on campus first time. And I want to thank Jim Stent for introducing Professor Perkins to our audiences to this opportunity. We have Professor Perkins, we have students here, we have ambassadors, we have a lot of diplomats, we have business people, private sector, NGOs, international foundations, UN-related agencies. So it's a wide, diverse range of audience.
Thank you, Professor Thitinan. Just to get off to the start, I am terrible with PowerPoint, and if I actually run the PowerPoint, I will quickly forget that I'm running the PowerPoint, and then I'll be so far off of it. So if you want to have it's only about 3 slides. For most of you, it's irrelevant. And you're in charge of however you want to use those 3 slides. This is my first time at Chulalongkorn University. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, I actually did come to Thailand from time to time. We came here first in '62 when we were returning, and as an undergraduate at Cornell. I mean, Cornell is many of you probably know, is probably the only really major Southeast Asia center at Harvard, and so I was the only major in what was called Far Eastern Studies in those days. Literally, only one of my senior class. There was one person in the sophomore class. And while I focused on China, I also did quite a bit on Southeast Asia. In fact, a requirement was a course on a seminar on the Chinese and Southeast Asia. And my advisor on that was a man named Lauriston Sharp, who was an anthropologist who did his career in Thailand. That was a long time ago, and then when I was with the Harvard Institute for International Development, I had some involvement with TDRI, the Thai Development Research Institute. But I haven't been back in 30 years. And so I was here on another occasion, and Jim Stent talked to Professor Thitinan and set this up. Now, the talk, I think everything I'm going to say today you already know. So, now, one response will be for you to all go to sleep. But that's what I'm going to, the main point of this talk is really how dramatic the last 2 years have been in terms of change in the way China is approaching the rest of the world. But the talk is going to be first a review of all of what's happened over the last 40 years, and that's why I say you all know this. But just remind, I'm going to focus first and at greatest length on the economy because it's what I know best. But then I'm going to say a bit about politics and the way things have changed in that regard. And then I'm going to say something about international security, military security toward the end. I have some notion that, and in this process, toward the end of the talk, I will also get into what is it that the U.S. is trying to do, to the extent that the U.S. is trying to do anything coherent whatsoever. So I'm not just going to talk about what the Trump administration is trying to do, because that is fairly incoherent. But I am going to talk about what some of the senior military people and so on. But that'll all be very brief. But I want to, as Professor Thitinan said, I first actually went to the People's Republic of China in 1974, when it was still, of course, the Cultural Revolution. And at that time, no one in China had any interest in learning anything about the rest of the world. It was all, and you couldn't have honest conversations with anybody. No Chinese would be alone with a foreigner in that context. I remember I had a friend in the U.S. liaison office there who said the only time he had a free conversation with anybody in China was when he's riding his bicycle, and if he was alongside somebody, he might start a conversation with another bicycle rider, because the bicycle rider could always veer off if somebody started listening. Well, but that all, that changed dramatically in '78. And what I want to do is sort of go through the very steady, the gradual change in the economy, because it's really quite extraordinary, effective change from a centrally planned command system to a pretty sophisticated market-oriented system, albeit of a particular type. And I want to just, go through that history and then talk about what's happening now. And of course, and that's why I say I think you will know all of this, but I'm only really reminding you. China actually opened up to foreign trade before the normal date for reform. The normal date for reforms is late 1978, but as soon as actually within a year after Mao had died, China had basically opened up to foreign trade. They basically told the enterprises that they could go out and buy foreign technology without it costing them politically in a major way. And they went off big time. And in fact, letters of intent, according to one of the Hong Kong bank's estimates, to buy foreign technology and foreign equipment, something like $600 billion was signed in 1977, 78. And given that China had exports of less than $10 billion, that was a problem. And of course, so most of those letters of intent were torn up. But the opening of the economy is the one consistent thing that has gone through and is still true today. And then, of course, the other big change in 78, 9 to 80 was the dismantling of the whole commune system, the return to household agriculture, and an enormous boom in incomes in the rural areas, going back to households plus increase in prices of agricultural products. And then you finally, over time, the credibility this gave to Zhao Ziyang, who was the prime minister at the time, became prime minister because of his work in Sichuan. He and some of the radical think tanks around him, the so-called Tigaiswa, the Systems Reform Institute, and a rural development group headed by a man named Zhu Runsheng, these were full of young people who wanted to fundamentally change the system, and Zhao Ziyang made a major effort in that. And so beginning in 1984, they tried to loosen up in a major way the whole system of central planning of industry. Initially, that was basically they created a two-price system, which was going to create problems later in terms of corruption. But the idea was that enterprises could sell their surplus on the market, and small enterprises, of which there were a good many in China, could get a hold of inputs much more readily through the market. Didn't have to fight with the centrally planned bureaucrats. That gradually, over the next 7 or 8 years, led to the elimination of state-set prices for industrial inputs, because what the people who the state enterprises that tried to hold on to their low-price state-allocated goods found that the goods weren't arriving rapidly. They were getting postponed because all the companies producing wanted to sell at the market prices, which were much higher. So you've got basically the elimination of the two-price system by the early 90s. Everything, by the end of this, at the beginning of this period, Chen Yun and the more conservative figures who wanted to go back to central planning had a dominant role. By the end of the 80s, they no longer had a powerful role, except for the brief period 89, 90, 91. After June 4th, 1989, the conservatives made a move back, but Deng Xiaoping put an end to that, as you all know, in 1992 with the Southern movement. And then you get, in the 90s, theoretically China had opened up to foreign direct investment in the 80s, but the only people who could have a secure relationship if they invested were mostly people who were originally from Guangdong, that is, they were Hong Kong people, Macau people. They could have personal relationships and have smaller investments. By the 90s, China had created some of the legal framework that the large-scale investors, and you began to get the boom in foreign direct investment in China. But more importantly, while the banking system and the financial system in the 1990s on paper looked like a modern financial system. That is, they had abolished the Soviet-style mono bank where the central bank and the commercial banks are all one, and where the bank was a very weak instrument. The control of the money, control of inflation was in the hands of the Central Planning Commission, not the central bank. And in fact, whenever the central bank under the central planning period tried to do anything that was restrictive, they usually got purged. But for the first time in the mid-1990s, as this policy, which mainly meant the state enterprises could borrow whenever they liked, whether they would pay it back or not, and the restraint of the Planning Commission had disappeared, but the enterprises and the banks were still operating like they were under central planning. So you were getting inflation. You got inflation in the late 80s. You got a big inflation market in the 90s. And then they put Zhu Rongji, who was then the deputy prime minister, as head of the central bank. He was, to put it mildly, a pretty tough person who was not at all intimidated by other politicians. And he brought an end to the inflation, but much more important, he set out to fundamentally cure the problem in the financial sector, was to turn it into a real sector where the banks actually looked at the enterprises and decided whether they were creditworthy or not, and made loans on that basis, and where the central bank had the power to control the money supply and so on. But to do that, he had to somehow rein in the state enterprises, and he did it in a couple of ways. One, he just told them they had to get rid of, and they got rid of 40, 50 million workers, which, if if you're firing 40 or 50 million workers in any country, you potentially have a bit of a political problem. But he did it. They enforced it. It was theoretically these people retired, they got other jobs, but not so good. But the other thing he did was he began the effort to join the WTO. As China had been negotiating joining the World Trade Organization for some time, but they had a lot of stiff conditions that they wanted to be treated like a developing country and so on and so forth. And the U.S. and the Europeans were having none of it, so they were going nowhere. But Zhou Ji, I think, didn't really want to make the change so much in order to get exports booming. Exports were already booming in a big way. But he needed a weapon in which to deal with the state enterprises. And so he went to Washington. He met with President Clinton and Bob Rubin, the Secretary of Treasury, and basically said to them, we'll agree to all your terms. We won't fight on any of them. We'll agree. And Clinton and Rubin then thought about it for a bit and said, well, it's a good offer, but we still have a problem with the U.S. Senate and so on. We don't think we can do it. Zhou Ji then went out to Denver, gave a speech to 500 or 600, I don't remember exactly, businessmen. The White House phone started ringing. Zhou Ji basically described exactly what happened. He then came back to Boston and made the same speech, but by the time he got back to Boston, the White House phones had been ringing so hard that Clinton and Rubin totally changed their position. They began the negotiations to accept the Chinese and make China a member of the WTO. That played a key role in bringing discipline into the whole industrial, and particularly into many of the state enterprises. There's still a big problem today, and I'll get back to that later. So when you then move on from the 1990s into the 2000s, what you get is a steady improvement, piece by piece in the financial sector. The people running the financial sector are becoming very well trained. People who know a lot of what they're doing. They're no longer party apparatchiks and things of that sort. You get increasing in the universities in terms of providing well-trained people. In the universities in the 80s were in terrible shape. By the late 90s, early 2000s, China is beginning to get large numbers of universities now, and now has, I don't know, a whole pile of them on the top, 100, 200, 500 of, the Jiaotong and the Times lists of the best universities in the world. And I'll get back to how that's changed a little bit in the last couple of years later too. Anyway, there was a steady progress, and you get to the 18th Party Congress in 2013, and the main sort of document of the 18th Party Congress in 2013 is basically a list of 60 reforms that still need to be done, things that need to be completed. And about half of those, by my way of counting, which includes the legal system, for example, at least the commercial side of the legal system, we're dealing with how to make markets work better. And it was a good list. The list was basically came out of the Development Research Center, and the Development Research Center and the World Bank had a big study, joint study, on what further reforms were really necessary to complete China's complete move to a full market economy and an efficient market economy. The reason I've had a long relationship off and on with people in the Development Research Center. And so think I can fairly safely say that that 18th Party Congress document was very much closely related to that study. Liu He, who has been doing, as the chief economics advisor to Xi Jinping. Liu He was the party secretary of the Development Research Center when that study was done, and I think he was probably the architect of at least played the strong political support role in those 60 reform documents, particularly the economic and economic legal side. So that, in a sense, it was a high point. If China had gone ahead and implemented that, I think you would have had a fairly, you would have gone toward a fairly pure economy. Then you go forward to the 19th Party Congress, and there's not a word. The reform, this reform agenda has basically disappeared, and the main thrust of the 19th Party Congress is that the state enterprises are the critical leading role of the economy, and that the party committees and of the enterprises, including the private enterprises, are going to now play a major role in the management of the enterprises. For those of you who know Chinese history going back, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, a big issue all along was a debate between red and expert, with the red pretty much dominating the Cultural Revolution and the experts pushed aside. This is a somewhat modified version of the return of the red. Now, and with the statement in the 19th Party Congress, it wasn't entirely clear just how much, just exactly what the role of the party committees were going to be. You always have party committees. I mean, all of these big enterprises had party committees going way back. I mean, but the issue was, what is their role? And the role prior to this was really to make sure that there was nothing illegal going on, to make sure that labor was not going to cause a lot of trouble. Things that were sort of supportive of management. There was no real effort to influence the basic management decisions in enterprise. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing, but essentially it was a very different. Now it's and I don't, I'm not enough involved in enterprise management to know how serious the level of intervention is now. But what I do see is in the universities, and I have some fairly horrified friends describing to me, the party committees now sit not only at the top of the university, but they sit they are involved in down to the department levels, and they're down to supporting the design of curriculum and things of that sort. For primary and secondary schools, foreign textbooks have been totally prohibited. For the large part, foreign textbooks, at least particularly in the social sciences and economics and so on, are prohibited, are strongly discouraged in the universities. There are ways around it. As one professor said to me, I assign only articles, and they don't prohibit foreign articles now. But they prohibit. And then there's I was very much involved over a long period, beginning in the 1980s, but with the full cooperation of the State Education Commission in transforming the way economics was taught in the universities in China, and the interesting thing there was a key figure in the State Education Commission was totally supportive of having modern economics as taught in Thailand or the U.S. Replace Marxist political economy at both the undergraduate and graduate level in the universities, and so, for example, we had a joint program run by, the American committee run by Gregory Chow or Zhou Zhuang, and myself, and the Chinese committee chaired by a man named Huang Da, who was later president of Renmin University. But that State Education Commission supported it. We had a year-long graduate program in standard economics taught by visiting foreigners of various kinds. It was an integral part of the master's degree of 7 of the best universities in China. Now, up until a year or two ago, everything was, economics was taught pretty much the same way. It's the bigger issues in political science, of course, and so on. So there's been and then you have, in addition to that, gets into the whole change in the political situation. You have, people reporting on what professors are saying up until, most of the time up through 2 or 3 years ago. You didn't get up and you didn't get up and criticize the leadership of the Politburo or something like that. But you had, you could talk about. You couldn't advocate democracy for China and multi-party democracy, but you could talk about the way the systems work in the rest of the world. It's pretty much unrestrained, and it was really a pretty liberal system. That has changed, and people are, not a lot of people yet, but some are getting fired for being a little too risky, and I haven't been in China. I made 80-some trips or 90 trips to China, but this last year I haven't gone, partly because if I say what I'm saying here, I will get my friends in trouble or I'll get myself in trouble. And furthermore, my friends who do have long contacts with China are finding people reluctant to meet with them and so on and so forth. So it's been, there's been a very big, so the economic has switched very substantially toward back to the state model. It's still very much an open economy. They welcome foreign direct investment and so on. And the politics of this that backs this up is moving. Now, I don't want to give anybody the impression they're moving back to anything like the early 70s or the 60s. They're not. This is not, those were a full totalitarian system where everybody was afraid to talk to everybody. And I could give you some personal instances, but I've got to pay some attention. I'll have you all asleep. And of course, into this economic side, then steps a new American president by the name of Donald Trump, and so this shift within China comes up in a clash with a president of the United States for the first time, probably in my life, and I was born in 1934, so. Actually doesn't believe in free trade. He believes in, he thinks tariffs are wonderful. He got a degree from Wharton. I don't know whether he missed the macroeconomic lectures or what, but he honestly deeply believes and has believed for 20 years that bilateral trade imbalances are a problem and are largely due to cheating by your partners. And if people stopped cheating, we wouldn't have trade imbalances. Now, anybody who has studied any macroeconomics, and at least remembers some of it, knows that the reason why you have trade deficits overall is because you spend more than you save. The difference is made up by importing, only slightly. In the U.S. case, the savings rate is low, the investment rate is fairly high, and the net result is we have an overall trade deficit. And it has nothing to do, and the reason why it's a bilateral deficit with China is because China took over the final assembly I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons is China took over the final assembly that used to be done in Korea and Taiwan and so on, and so those goods are registered as being from China, and so China has very big trade surplus with the U.S. And so the negotiations that then have proceeded have basically, they've been two parts. Mr. Lighthizer, who is the trade negotiator, actually, I mean, I think he does really care. He's a hardliner, and he certainly doesn't believe in free trade, but he does believe that the main problems with China, and they are real problems, are the intellectual property area, the stealing of technology, and that sort of thing. Under Obama, there was they actually had an agreement on stealing technology. There was still a problem of figuring out. I mean, with the technology issue, all countries that have the capacity steal military technology. So you can't say, oh, well, you've got to stop stealing military technology, because that means if you want somebody else to do it, you should do it yourself. And in no way the U.S. is going to stop doing it. So, or Europe or Russia or China or anything. So the problem is, but in the U.S. and EU, you don't steal commercial technology in order to help your own private firms. That's a no-no. In China, it was not a no-no, and it's not a no-no. So the question, so they negotiated a deal that there were still problems, because then you get into the question of what is a military technology and what's not. But anyway, and Obama administration was working on that, but that's all out the window now. And essentially the deal they've worked out has nothing to do with technology and intellectual property. It's all to do with China buying huge amounts of Chinese American products, large amounts that I think most of the people who look at it that I respect think it is probably going to be impossible to meet. But I don't know whether the Chinese think they can renegotiate it after Trump is either not reelected or reelected. I mean, it's $40 billion worth of agricultural products, which is more than China has ever bought from them, and so on. And who in the U.S. is going to produce all these products remains to be seen. So it's a somewhat odd sort of trade agreement that isn't really much of a trade agreement. So you have this fundamental change in the Chinese side, which is really moving away, although formally totally supportive, and Xi Jinping presents himself as being a supporter of the international economic order and the liberal global economy and so on. In reality, their state enterprise and their intellectual property policies are not really terribly supportive. And you have in the U.S. a president that's clearly not supportive. And where that's going, and that's backed up to some degree by politics both in the U.S. and the Western world, where there is a lot of unhappiness that many people attribute to the globalization and the rising inequality, and the parts of America, for example, that have benefited enormously from globalization, and the parts of America that have not benefited, and same with Europe and so on. So that's we're in a very difficult period where the system that all of us have known for the last 30 years in the international community is I think, being seriously undermined both by the U.S. and to some degree by China. And the problem within China is it's fundamentally changed. The state enterprises in China are unquestionably substantially less efficient than the private sector. There's overwhelming evidence, but so the notion that you're going to go back and rely on the state enterprises means you're going back toward even slower growth. Now, the slower growth today in China is actually mostly a product of the fact that countries, when they reach a certain level, no one grows at 9% once you get beyond a certain level. That level is usually somewhere in the $13,000, $14,000 to $20,000 per capita. I could go at length into the technical aspects of this and why, but China is basically at that level. I wrote an article with a former student of mine, Tom Rowski, back in 2006, said that during this decade they might be able to hold on to 6%, and then after that it'll be probably even lower. That I think is still a valid statement, and there's catch-up growth. In China, for example, they're limited to how much high growth you can get from more infrastructure investment. The infrastructure investment, as you all know, there's magnificent infrastructure in China now, but the rate of return on existing infrastructure is clearly falling. A highway to Tibet is not the same as a highway between, or a fast train between Shanghai and Beijing and so on. So the rate of return on that, housing, badly needed in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. Now, housing, the level of per capita housing in the urban areas is, I've forgotten the exact figure, but it's gone from having 18 square meters per family of 3 to about 100 square meters per family of 3. The housing is really pretty good in China at this point in the urban areas. The rural areas, it's not that big a problem. So there's a slowdown, and this is leading to, this is undoubtedly part of this shift in politics toward a much more conservative, the party officials now regularly have to play a little game where the right answer to many of the questions is things like Xi Jinping thought. And they have to demonstrate, the party members have to demonstrate that they are playing that game on a regular basis and so on. It's a shift toward a state or state-led economy and a more authoritarian, although far from still totalitarian economy and politics. Into this final set of remarks, where does the international security and military issue fit into this picture? And here, the basic, again, if you look at from when Deng Xiaoping basically came back to full power in the late '78, he was back in some power in early '78. I actually was in a meeting with him then as well as in '74. But he basically, for the first decade or longer, there was almost no increase in the military budget whatsoever of China. And many people say that was because he was interested in really pushing economic development. And I think that was partly true. But it's also true that China simply did not have the technical capacity to produce any useful. Producing more T-54 tanks and MiG-19 aircraft was not going to increase Chinese security whatsoever. And then about, 10 or 15 years ago, I'd have to go get my statistical handbook out. China began this increase in spending on the military, but the increase was in line with the growth. Now, when you're growing at 10% a year, that means the military budget's growing at a fairly rapid rate. But by itself, it wasn't really that alarming because countries are going to want to build up their military strength to have security. It's a normal thing and China then began to have the technology, and it had the resources to build, and so it was going fairly steadily. But they still followed the Deng Xiaoping advice to sort of maintain a low profile, stay out of major involvements internationally, and build up on strength both in the economy and gradually in the military sphere. That, of course, has all changed in the last few years too, and China has begun to take a much more active role. And whether and because of that, or the militaries of the one I know the most about, because I participate in discussions with military figures, particularly in the Kennedy School at Harvard, on a fairly regular basis. And I have a former student who was a major, the senior general, who plays a major role in some of that thinking. And right now, what you've got is the Chinese, the U.S. government. Now, the actual actions of the military are all tied down in the Middle East because of our disastrous involvement with Iraq and everything that's followed since then. But the actual planning of the senior military figures is now almost entirely geared to how to deal with China. Not to deal with China in terms of going to war, but how to prevent China from doing things that could lead ultimately to war. And so you're getting a situation in the U.S. where the actions on both the U.S. and on the Chinese side are leading the entire to a situation where China is now become not an enemy exactly, but has become the major international problem, both in economic terms and but particularly in strategic terms. And in that context, the Belt and Road Initiative, lots of the Belt and Road has all kinds of dimensions to it, and I'd be glad to talk about it. But one element is clearly, there is the ports in Myanmar, the ports in Pakistan, the base in Djibouti are all part of and a perfectly legitimate concern of China to not be caught in a situation where all of their energy and so on is coming through the Straits of Malacca, which they are afraid would be cut off, and therefore they're creating ways around that. And if you look at where the pipelines and all that are in Myanmar, it has very little to do with Myanmar and everything to do with supplies going into Yunnan and beyond. So, I think I probably should leave it there. I've taken 40 minutes. That's a pure accident that I actually ended up at that time. And I think there's been this it's a dramatic change. There was a dramatic change, particularly in China, but it's a dramatic change to some degree in the U.S. In the U.S., it's possible we'll be lucky and we will switch back a bit in next November, but there's a good chance that we won't. And even if we do switch back, the trade situation is vis-a-vis China and the U.S. is not going to change dramatically, and the security situation is not going to change either very much. Those are really now embedded in the thinking of people who do this for a living, which is not me. But so I'll stop there, and we can talk about it. You can tell me why I don't know what I'm talking about or whatever.
This has been a tour de force. I think that you've gone back to the 50s. I mean, you could have talked about the Great Leap and the Cultural Revolution. You started off coming down to the Deng Xiaoping. It's interesting. The year after Mao died, China began to open up. That's something that to note. And the Deng Xiaoping era was remarkable, right? Transformative for China. So you've given us the whole timeline. We're going to go to Ambassador Kasit for some comments and maybe some localizing, regionalizing the issues that you've touched on. But let me just ask a couple of questions at this time. And the audience also prepare your questions, comments. We'll come to you in a few minutes. First, the U.S.-China rivalry, the geostrategic rivalry, do you think this is going to be long-term? I mean, regardless of what happens this November in the U.S., it seems to have bipartisan opposition and skepticism, criticism of China. And secondly, what you've described in this timeline, I mean, China is such an enormous country, but it has a lot of stress and strains. And you mentioned now there's a move now, a bit more conservative now. It was more open. Now the party is more in control. So there's an inherent contradiction between being open and being in control. And so for us, I think in a broader scheme, is this, they've managed it, it's been sustained, but can we assume that they will know what they're doing and that it will be sustained, and that the China model and China way of doing it can be maintained? So two questions, US, China, and China itself.
Okay. The China itself, there's no question I think the leadership of China thinks there are some very serious domestic problems, and they're worried about. They include the slower growth rate. It's much higher. It's not so easy to sell yourself as increasing everybody's standard of living by 7, 8, 10% a year. You have to, and the one thing that is true of China is true of a good deal of Asia, but not all of it. There is the amount of progress on the political reform front, if you like, has been minimal. China still feels that it has to be run in some ways like it always was run. I'm being, a slight overstatement to say it's basically the approach of the imperial Chinese, as you basically have a group of cadre who are very well imbued with the fundamental ideology of the society. For 1,000 years, that was, very well-trained Confucian scholars who really believed in the Confucian and the value system of that, and they were the leaders of the government under an authoritarian emperor. And then the Communist Party in 1949 certainly had a very strong cadre of people that really believed in the communist, in Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought, and so on, but through using essentially authoritarian means, and it's essentially what you're getting now after a quite liberal political where frankly, you're now trying to go back in that direction. I don't mean all the way back. You can't go back and repeat. And the question then is, and they must have at least some insecurity about whether they can actually get people to believe. I mean, I'm prepared to believe, from what friends of mine who spend much more time thinking about this, that Xi Jinping really does believe in a whole Marxist way of thinking and so on, and not just about contradictions, but more fully. But the notion that he's going to sell, people in their 20s and 30s and 40s on this is, I think, highly doubtful. Given that they eagerly, I just look at where I knew best, the economic change, the degree to which people were willing to shuck Marxist political economy in the economics field was with the great enthusiasm. They got rid of it, and the notion that they're going to try to bring it back, I think, is going to be hard. So there is an insecurity underlying this that has led to a conservative reaction. It's my judgment. It's the judgment of some others. I'm not a political scientist, however. One of the ways you study with economics, it's much simpler in trying to understand politics. But the other question has to do with whether this U.S.-China relationship is sort of permanently into. I think the short answer is it's as long as China is moving in this direction, there's no way we're going to go back to anything like the cooperation of 15 or 20 years ago. When I first started going, even in '74, was a U.S. senator. The U.S. foreign policy and Chinese foreign policy were completely in sync. The Chinese foreign policy was very simple to understand. If it helped the Soviet Union, they were against it. If it hurt the Soviet Union, they were for it. And that was, with only a slight modification, that was a good deal of the American foreign policy. And so we had a lot of, that's dead. The potential areas of strain obviously start with Taiwan, but you have the strains in the South China Sea. You have the strains in but Taiwan is by far the most serious because it's the one that could totally get out of hand if China were to decide to use force. I don't mean an outright invasion. There are a lot of things they can do short of invasion to make life in Taiwan miserable. But if assuming they don't go there, most of the rest of it is manageable, but it's still in the context of a contest. And if the trade issue, which is dominated by sort of aggressive state enterprises and so on, I think on the end it's going to hurt China, but in terms of its economic performance, but it's not going to make for an easy relationship with the United States or Europe, really, for probably the foreseeable future. The future in my case isn't all that long. So when you're born in 1934, you don't live forever. So at least that's what I'm told.